Good evening. Now, some of the observations that Professor Hovler made about John Bascom at the first lecture, those observations help frame our lecture for tonight. Bascom, you may recall, asserted that all things relate to one another and all individuals belong as citizens to a political community. But in his view, the ideal of a collectivity lay in ruins, and this was in the 1880s. He thought that the nation possessed little sense of the public interest or the common good. And it is that interest in the public, in the common good, that concerned Bascom and others who came to represent the unifying vision for the Wisconsin idea. Now, the conditions thought to imperil the common good have not always been the same across periods and across observers. Bascom and his associates, for example, centered their attention very much on extreme differences in wealth and privilege that they observed. And they lamented the absence of laws that would support the larger society. And as you know then, that led a lot to the relationships with the legislature. They were concerned with those kinds of inequities in wealth and privilege. Last week's lecture laid bare the inequities found in the realm of education. Professor Ladson-Billings, you will recall, outlined the presence and consequences of restricted educational opportunities. And incidentally, she had reported data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, that had been a little dated, she thought. But you will recall the next day, the Wisconsin State Journal published the most recent data that simply confirmed what had been the pattern for over time, the pattern of the gaps that she talked about. Now, many of the discussions you have posted cite the effects of restrictions on the marginalized. Let me here interrupt and note that, yes, I've made reference in the past to what you have posted. And those who have not been taking the course for credit have said, what? You mean there are postings? Yes, there are. And you can have access to the post by going to the Canvas website. So if you're not familiar with that website, just check with any of the instructors of record, and you can have access then to the post and actually join in the posting and the commentaries that people make. But with reference to last week's lecture, I was just noting that a lot of your post had talked about how consequential you saw the discussion for being, looking at what happens to those on the margins. But the question could be raised, doesn't the restriction of opportunities and the presence of exclusionary actions have widespread consequences? Aren't there effects for the collectivity and not just those on the margin? You may recall that the Wisconsin idea, that idea of service was not that of noblesse oblige. And I'm very indebted to Gwen Drury for making that special point. She was pointing out that the idea was not that people of high rank must behave nobly and kindly towards others. No, the notion was all would benefit from the engagement that would come about by reaching out and ensuring participation in democracy. So those educated at the university, those directing policies in the state, the idea has been take account not just of the interest of others, but the collective interest. And it's this attention to shared concerns that's the hallmark of the path-breaking work from Professor Katherine Cramer. She's known for her innovative approach to understanding conditions that can heighten polarization and threaten public engagement. But she doesn't stop there and say, these are the things that are threats, but what are some of the responsible actions that can be taken? Her book, for example, on the politics of resentment and rural consciousness in Wisconsin has been noted time and again for its insights and its implications for achieving democracy. Here is an abiding question for her. Where should attention and resources be centered in order for the state and the nation, and I suppose we could even say the world, where should that attention be focused if we are to achieve justice and democracy for all? Professor Cramer then joins us tonight to review her work and offer insights on the strengthening of democracy. Professor Cramer.
I hope you, please, but wave if you can't hear me as I talk. Can all of you hear me? Okay, in the back, great, okay. So I want to start off with my childhood. So I grew up in Grafton, Wisconsin, which is about 20 miles north of Milwaukee. And the whole time I was growing up, my family was very proud of UW-Madison and the UW system. Neither of my parents had gone to school here or anywhere in the UW system, but they were ardent Badger fans. And the way they talked about the university instilled in me the Wisconsin idea ever before I knew it was a term, before I knew it was a phrase. Many of you have probably experienced this sense that the University of Wisconsin, whether we're talking about Wisconsin-Madison, another one of the schools, the UW Extension, that it belongs to the people of the state. And I knew that in the way my parents talked about the university, the way my neighbors and the rest of my family talked about the university. And so it's always been in me. And I just show you this map of Wisconsin. This is a rural urban map made by our own Applied Population Laboratory. Just to note, which will be relevant in a few minutes, the urban areas of the state are the blue areas, the rural areas of the state are the green areas. But I just wanted to point out where my hometown is. Right over here in Ozaukee County. And my parents still live there, so I'm still proud to say that's where I grew up. When I was growing up, oftentimes the political discussions going on in my home were quite different than the political discussions going on around me in Ozaukee County. And I'll leave that as it I'll just leave that. We can talk about it later if you'd like to. But it bred in me this curiosity in where do people get their thoughts about politics? Where do they get their points of view? And I learned through growing up in encountering those conversations in my home and the conversations with my dear friends that nobody was a bad person, even though they held different points of view, but they looked at the world in pretty different ways at times. In my field of public opinion, oftentimes the driving question is, what are people getting wrong? What is it that they don't know? What is wrong with them sometimes? What can be fixed so that they see the world the right way, which is often the way the speaker is seeing the world, right? Well, I resist that question, and thankfully I think because of my upbringing, it's been in me for a long time to resist that question. And instead, the question that's been driving me is, how do people understand the world? How are they understanding the world? So I'm going to tell you some stories about how I have studied that and to lay the foundation for this thing, this new public conversation network I've been working on called the Local Voices Network. So when I earned tenure here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I started engaging in a project that became this book, The Politics of Resentment book. And what it involved was me visiting these 27 communities across the state and inviting myself into conversations. A lot of the conversations took place before dawn in diners and gas stations and such. The intent of the study originally was not to study public opinion in rural areas of Wisconsin or small towns in Wisconsin. It was to study public opinion in a variety of places. And what happened was, through that experience, I learned about a sentiment that's very common in many of our smaller communities, our rural spaces, that I described as this resentment toward the cities or a rural consciousness. So briefly, I'm going to describe what I heard and to set the stage for other things I've encountered since then, and to set the stage for the Local Voices Network. So rural consciousness is basically just a label for an identity that I encountered of people in smaller places identifying as small town folks, not using that label, but talking about, people from places like this, for example, and feeling as though they weren't getting their fair share. So feeling as though they were being left behind in several different ways. So one way was they felt like they were not getting their fair share of decision-making power. Sometimes people would say things to me like, all the decisions that affect my life are made in Madison or Milwaukee or Washington, D.C., for example, and they're communicated out to us. People aren't listening to us. We're kind of told what the rules are. They were also telling me that they were not getting their fair share of resources. Oftentimes they were perceiving that the bulk of taxpayer dollars go to the cities and they don't see their taxpayer dollar coming back to their own communities. Another way to think about this is that they saw that there was wealth in the world and it wasn't there in their communities. It was in the cities primarily, right? The good jobs are in the cities, the construction is in the cities, the property values are in the cities. And so people were perceiving in that way they were on the short end of the stick. And finally, they were telling me in a variety of ways, we don't get our fair share of respect. Because the folks making the rules, making those decisions that affect our lives don't know us. They don't know what life is like in a place like this. They don't understand it. And they don't really respect it because they think we're uneducated, unsophisticated, that we're racist, that we're sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic, so on and so forth. And all of that I labeled resentment because at times it was anger. We hear a lot about anger these days. But more often than not, it was this sentiment that had been there for a good long time, well before I walked in 2007. And it was sort of this simmer, this kind of undertone that was complicated and ripe for political maneuvering because there's many different layers to it. You can probably hear a bunch already just in the brief way I explain it. So it was resentment towards cities and city people, but also resentment towards elites, decision makers, cultural elites, people making the movies, making the music, journalists, one political party more than another, resentment toward the Democrats, and also racism or resentment towards racial and ethnic minorities. So I call this fertile ground for a political entrepreneur because if you listen to it, you can see that it's pretty ripe territory for someone to come in and label who's the us and who's the them, right? Because people were saying to me, we work really hard, we deserve more, and it seems to us that our hard-earned taxpayer dollars are going somewhere else, not to us, to other people, and maybe people who don't deserve it as much as we do. It was also fertile ground for people to say, you know what, we need less government. Because oftentimes people would say, look around at my community, and you tell me that whatever government is doing is working for people like me. And so people perceived that government was not on their side. So why would they want more of it? They were perceiving that government in general is run by people who don't understand their lives and don't respect them. And basically, it was an urban thing. So even public school teachers, of which there are at least a few in every community in Wisconsin, those folks were doing their jobs according to decisions made in cities, according to urban values. So it was ripe ground for a politician to come in and hear that and respond to it. When Scott Walker got elected in 2010 as our governor, he enacted or proposed legislation that is famously now known as Act 10, right? Which undercut public employee unions. And the response here in Madison was this, right? Thousands of people day after day protesting at the Capitol. But just outside Madison, the response was often quite different. People were saying things like, it's about time. It's about time that someone asked public employees to pay in more to the pot because they have health care, they have pensions, my taxpayer dollars are going to pay for that, and I can't afford health care for my family, and I don't have a pension. So when 2016 rolled around, we realized that Wisconsin was something of a bellwether state. When Donald Trump got elected, it was a slightly different thing. He's a very different politician than Scott Walker, but in his own way, he was saying to us and to folks in these smaller communities, you're right to be so upset. You do deserve more, and you know what? They're to blame, or they're to blame. And his targets were not public employees so much, but different folks, immigrants, Muslims, so forth and so on. So that is why my book got so much attention. So before it was published in 2016, before the presidential election, and people in Wisconsin and here on campus, we were definitely talking about it a lot, trying to listen to those messages and understand what it meant for us as a state. But when Donald Trump got elected, suddenly many people were turning to me and saying, what's going on in Wisconsin? What's going on in rural Wisconsin? What's going on in rural America? And it's been obviously very gratifying for people to want to hear what it is that I have learned, but it's also been really sobering because people have shared all kinds of points of view with me, which I will share with you in just a moment. But first I want to just pause and reflect what it means for a public opinion researcher to study public opinion by going out, driving around in my Volkswagen and eventually a Prius in smaller communities around the state and inviting myself into conversations. And I believe that it is a very Wisconsin idea thing. And it's not a surprise that I'm a researcher here and I did that kind of work as a faculty member here, right? Here's what I mean. I'm basically listening to folks, right? I'm saying, I'm part of this community. I want to know what you think. And that's my point of being with you. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm not running for office. I want to hear what you have in your head and your heart. And so in all of these different ways, I think this is a Wisconsin idea type of thing. Pardon me as I mess up my PowerPoint here. You will find that ethic a lot on this campus and throughout the UW system, that ethic of we are not above the public, we are not separate from the public, but we are part of the public. Many of us are active in our communities in which we work, and so we engage in that respect, but also in the way we do our work. We see ourselves as part of the people with whom we're trying to do this thing called democracy. In another way, my going out to communities and listening to folks is just one example of people trying to enable the public to teach us, whatever our field of work. You'll find it in science, you will find it in all kinds of social science, you'll find it in the arts, and it's something that honestly keeps me here at this university. This idea that we have the celebration of the fact that, yes, we may be experts in our field, but we are constantly kind of trying to learn from the people with whom we share community. And finally, as a political scientist, a lot of this comes back to democracy for me and the kind of democracy I want to see in the world and what I think I can contribute to a democracy. And I have found through this driving around the state, inviting myself into conversations thing, as well as listening to all the communication that's been sent to me since the 2016 presidential election, that listening is so fundamental and so rare, all too rare in our democracy, right? But I say it's so fundamental and so fundamental to democracy because at root, democracy is about us making decisions that affect one another. And how can we do that if we don't have a basic understanding of each other's life, of each other's point of view? So, back to these communications. So, after my book came out, I mean, honestly, the night of the election, people started writing to me, typically through email, sometimes through surface mail. And at some point, I had a really hard time keeping up. So if you've written me a message and I still have not responded, I'm very sorry. Come talk to me afterwards. But what I decided to do in order to make sure that I was hearing as much as I could from these messages was to turn it into a research study in a way. So I systematically went through and tried to learn from them. And what I heard was that, well, let me share with you some of what I heard. What I'm going to share with you is these are basically parts of messages from people who are more left-leaning and heard me speak or read my book or read something that I wrote and feel the need to communicate to me what they think. So oftentimes they're not criticizing my book or saying something about the book. They're responding to the people I talked about in my book. Even they can't connect, with those people directly, and so they're sharing with me what they think. So they had. Well, let me just read it out loud. Apparently, these people are from outer space, right? Apparently, the news sources for many folks are from their own corner of the universe, right? Where are these people getting their news? What role does Fox News play? You can imagine how often that question has come up. Another communication. Was there not a recognition that federal dairy product price supports, crop insurance, and other price support programs helped? In other words, don't these folks who are voting against larger government or government in general, don't they realize that they're getting government program support themselves? Another type of criticism that came up is, they're the folks who you encountered are the people who are left behind. Many of those elites that they're criticizing are their own children who left to go where the opportunities are. Who stayed behind? Those shy of taking risks, those with conservative personality profiles, those left behind find comfort in their own resentment of urban success. That's what I mean by it's pretty sobering. I find this really depressing. Perhaps what's just as depressing as hearing this criticism is recognizing just how similar it is to the conversations I experienced in rural areas in small town Wisconsin. So for example, pretty much you can hear echoes of all of this in my fieldwork. So a very common theme after the presidential election, when I went back to many of the communities that I had visited to give them a copy of my book, was what is wrong with those people who voted for Hillary Clinton? Those city people, they are being fooled. They don't know how to make decisions for themselves. So for example, people would say things like, you know what, they vote on the basis of identity. Women vote for Hillary because she's a woman. Kathy, who'd you vote for? Or, Barack Obama, people voted for him because he's black. Or they'd say things like, there are people who are getting government handouts and they just want to vote for Democrats to keep those handouts. Or they'd say things like they're hypocritical. So for example, sometimes I would gently introduce the topic of Donald Trump and women, and people would say, yeah, how is that different than Bill Clinton? They're so hypocritical, right? Or sometimes they would say, you know, we've tried to have conversations with our relatives, for example, who are Democrats, but it's just impossible. You can't have a conversation with them. Yeah, that's the thing we've noticed, this one guy's telling me. If you get a Republican and a Democrat just talking about it, the election, the Democrats seems like they just go ballistic, over the top. Doesn't matter what you say, you're just totally wrong. Won't even allow himself to listen to what you have to say. I'm going to go back here for a moment. How many of you are feeling just kind of crummy right now? Yeah, you can like feel it in your body in different ways, right? Me too. Me too. And the sad thing for me is that I find all of this energy we are spending as a society on the flaws of each other is so counterproductive. It's not just uncomfortable, it's counterproductive, right? Because all of that is distracting us from what is really wrong with our system. All this energy we are spending on what is wrong with them and how can we go about fixing them is not energy we are spending on what is wrong with the system that has brought us to this point, where the world is so clearly carved up into us and them, the communication that we receive about the other side, whatever that side is profiting from the divisiveness. All of it is enabling us to basically disengage, or if we are engaging in a way that's defensive and not productive in terms of, I think, the democracy most of us want to see. And unfortunately, what it does is distract us from the policy making, actually, which enables people to continue to pass policy that actually does little to improve our lives. So, my question as someone who identifies with the Wisconsin idea is, what do I do, right? What do I do as a public opinion scholar? Should we be asking, what's wrong with those people, or should we be asking what is wrong with the system? You already know what I think. I think that question is the latter, right? What can I do to change the system? What should be done with the system? Well, like many of you, probably after the 2016 election, I've spent a lot of time on that question. How should I be using my talents in this historical moment, right? Why is it that I'm here on this planet, in this country, in this state, at this moment, having done this study in which I drove around and listened to people, right? Well, I think it has something to do with this widespread need to listen to each other, to better understand one another, and also this widespread desire to be heard. Because as I was describing those folks in small town Wisconsin about how they feel like they don't get their fair share of attention, they don't get their fair share of resources, and they don't get their fair share of respect, how many of you identified with that? Probably a lot of you, right? Regardless of where you live or where you grew up. So many of us want our voices to be a part of the process, and we want to be respected by people making the decisions. So here's the thing I'm working on, this Local Voices Network. By chance, totally by chance, and it's one of the most fortuitous events of my life, I met this gentleman by the name of Deb Roy, who's a scientist at MIT, at the MIT Media Lab, who runs this lab called the Laboratory for Social Machines. He's a person you can't easily describe, but he's basically a computer engineer, computer scientist, natural language processing guy who has built this great lab of very wonderful people and a nonprofit called Cortico, which is a close partner of the lab that helps deploy the things that they create. So when Deb and I met by chance, we recognized very quickly that we had this shared concern over the way we all are communicating with one another in the post-2016 election environment. And this is the way we would describe a lot of our mediated communication. Just usually we're shouting at each other if we're talking to each other at all, that a lot of our communication profits on divisiveness, as I've already complained. And this instead is what we're focusing on, we're aiming for, to lift up the voices of people who don't feel heard, to have more nuanced communication in which it isn't so clear who's the us and who's the them, but there's more focus on the ways in which we are alike, the ways in which those boundaries are less clear than sometimes our politicians would like us to believe, and is more constructive in the sense of helping us communicate about what we want to see in the world and how do we bring it about. So we've created this thing called the Local Voices Network. And Cortico, this nonprofit I mentioned, is basically the network operator. So there are many people involved here in the creation of the Local Voices Network. We're a staff of about 26 now, I think, grown quite a bit since January. So the Local Voices Network became a thing in Madison in just January of this year. But this is the mission statement. Our intent is to foster better understanding of one another. So we're trying to foster conversations in communities, geographic places, and in the media that helps us understand one another better. And I'm going to explain how we're trying to do that. So we early on realized that, okay, we are bringing together human beings and technology. And I am 100% sure there's at least one of you in the audience who's already skeptical. Right? Because bringing people and humans together in service of democracy, wow, we have not done a great job at that as a society so far, right? Right. So we thought, okay, let's be clear about our principles and let's make sure in all of our design decisions we follow through on them. So the first here, authentic voices, is this idea that we want to focus on stories. We want people to be communicating about their lived experience as opposed to their bullet points, as opposed to arguing with one another, coming into a room together and stating their point of view. Instead, we want people to be sharing who they are in the world and their experience of the world. We also want to engage a wide range of perspectives. So not the usual suspects. When you say a public conversation network, you can imagine who the typical participant might be. We want a wide range of people participating. And we've also been guided by a community-first approach, meaning these are conversations that are taking place in geographic communities, and now we have, I guess, 5 chapters, depending on how you count it. I'll show you in a moment. And in each place, the network is looking a little bit different. The partners are a little bit different. The way we do outreach is a little bit different. We're trying to work with people in the community, people who want to have a Local Voices Network, and creating the network there around what they want. The transparent process thing goes back to the skepticism many of us have about technology and democracy, where we're trying to be as open as possible about all of our decisions, about where the funding comes from, where the data go, who's processing the data, all of those things. And finally, we want it to matter, right? We want the Local Voices Network to matter in terms of improving our understanding of one another, improving the nature of discourse in our local media, and improving the access that our local policymakers have to our concerns, our hopes and our concerns. So how are we doing this? Well, 3 key things flow out of those 5 design principles for us. One is the surfacing of underheard voices. It's really front and center for us to try to lift up and amplify the concerns of peoples who aren't normally heard in our communities. We are also trying to bridge across boundaries. We're trying to get people to understand one another better. People don't normally have the chance to listen to one another. And again, it's really important to us for people to be sharing their personal stories as opposed to their stances on an issue. Why is that? Just I'll say in a slightly different way. If I tell you a story about my family's experience with healthcare, that's a very different thing than me telling you, here's why I think Obamacare is great. Boom, 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 right? You're going to hear it differently. You're going to see the humanity and where I stand when I share with you my story. So I call it a public conversation network because it starts with small group conversations, much like I encountered in gas stations and diners and such around Wisconsin. The idea is that we're bringing together people, groups of people, about 6 people at a time, with a facilitator who's a volunteer, and the participants are also volunteers. And the facilitator is guiding people through a conversation that is recorded, which is the public part of the conversation, or one of the public parts of the conversation. So the volunteers know from the moment that they're recruited to take part in a conversation that this will be recorded, and other people who participate in the network will be able to listen in. We'll be able to hear that person's point of view, hear their stories. And local media journalists, partners, will also be able to listen in to better understand what's going on in a given community. What we're doing is taking those in-person conversations and recording them through technology that's been created by the engineers at Cortico. And so we have what they call, this is tech lingo that I am still learning, a scalable technology platform. And by that we mean we've created this thing called a digital hearth, which is this thing I'm showing you here. And what it is, pardon me, I'll go get one and show you. This thing. So, about the size of a hug, on purpose. That was my recognition, but the size is important because when it sits in the middle of a table, it sort of feels like the presence of a person. Not in a creepy way, but like it's significant, right? It's different than me taking my digital recorder, for example, and putting it on a table. Like it's there, and yet it doesn't feel like a piece of technology. So it's wood and fabric, and inside, as you can see here, there's an array of microphones that are connected by a Raspberry Pi, a computer. And so there's 8 microphones, and there's also a speaker. So the array of microphones, where the engineers are developing software so that the microphones can very accurately identify who is saying what in a conversation, so it can be matched to the transcription. Because if any of you have ever looked at a transcription of a group conversation, it's muddy, right? It's oftentimes hard to tell who's saying what. The speaker is there so that during the conversation, a host, which is what we call a facilitator, can stop the participants and say, you all have been talking about, say, affordable housing. I want you to hear the voices of folks who were talking about affordable housing just last week, say, on the north side of Madison. Let's listen to them, pretend they're in the room with us, and then we can reflect on what they had to say together. Pardon me, I better set this down. So here, oh, and I forgot to say, this is the controller. So this is just an iPhone, but we put it in a wooden case so that it doesn't feel like someone has their phone on the table, right? Don't you? It's not comfortable. It's like as if there's someone's waiting to not talk to you, right? Right. So this is the way the facilitator controls what's going on on the Hearth and starts the recording. And actually, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it now, but once it starts recording, it glows yellowy orangey like this underneath, so the participants know when it's on. We have a script that the facilitator uses to run the conversation, which is basically open-ended questions. These are the principles that have guided our construction of the script, but basically the questions are, who are you and what are your values? What brought you here today? What do you love about this community? What are you concerned about this community? What do you wish would be different 5 years from now? What do you wish your elected officials would hear about your life? And what's one thing you're going to be taking away from this conversation? So they're very broad questions by design because we want the participants to set the agenda. Or we want participants to say, here's what I'm really worried about, or here's what I really love about this place and I wish people knew, or I wish our politicians would do something to protect. We call it community-powered understanding because it is very much community-powered. I mentioned there's a staff of people staffing the Local Voices Network around the country, but for the most part, it's volunteer-driven and designed by community partners. So we started here in Madison back in January. This was our pilot because I live here, and I said to the rest of the team, Madison would be a great place to try this out because it is a place where there is a lot of engagement. People care about their community. There's a rich local media environment in which there are probably folks who are willing to experiment with us. And it's also a place where there are many things that we still need to have some good, hard conversations about. So we started here, And then we expanded to the Bronx in New York, and then to Boston, and now we're sort of all over New York City. We've also just started a chapter in Birmingham, Alabama. And over the summer, we also started chapters in Waupaca here in Wisconsin and Appleton, Wisconsin. The idea all along was to eventually, once we figured things out in Madison, to spread across the state of Wisconsin as much as possible, as well as across the country. The libraries have been super important for us because the libraries are where these things live. Here's a librarian that's getting a Hearth ready to check out. So if you are a volunteer with the Local Voices Network, if you're a facilitator, you get put on the list and you can take your Madison Public Library card and check one out. And the libraries have also helped us advertise the conversations. They've also taught us that these conversations need to take place all kinds of places, not just in the libraries. They need to take place where people are most comfortable. So these Hearths are portable. They don't need to be connected to the internet. They don't need to be connected to power while you're using them. People can just take them wherever people feel comfortable having a conversation. Here's just the barcode tag at the library. Here's our first host. This is Alex Lindemeyer, who owns Short Stack Eatery on State Street. She was the first person to check out a Hearth and is very excited about it, as you can see. And here she is taking it back to a restaurant to have a conversation. You can see here, there's a cup on the Hearth, which makes the engineers cringe every time we show this picture. But they are having a good time. So I want to play for you a conversation, if I can, from the Hearth. It'll just take me a moment here to call it up, just to give you a sense of what it's like to be in an LVN conversation and to hear a conversation. Pardon me. The UWNet is so powerful that it often knocks the connection out between the Hearth and this little controller. So just have to give it a moment here. Sorry. While we're waiting, I'm going to just forge ahead a little bit and I'll come back to it in a bit. But I want to show you here the data then. So when these things go back to the library, all the data, the recording of the conversation gets uploaded to the cloud. And then it's transcribed by a person. And then the software that the engineers have created connects the recordings up with the transcription, and they've created this website through which you can listen and read and explore the conversation. So this is what you would see if you were participating, if you had participated in a conversation in Madison. This page would open up, and here you can see a map that shows where all the conversations have taken place in Madison. And now this is just going to show you as if I were actually going through the website. Here's the map of the conversations. You can scroll it out, see some have taken place in Sun Prairie, in Middleton, in Fitchburg. Here I'm zooming into a particular conversation. When a particular conversation opens up, you see this kind of ribbon, which will show up here, that shows the different participants, those folks along the left here. The first person is always the facilitator. And the words that are popping up are kind of keywords that are the result of an algorithm that's basically saying what's going on in this part of the conversation. You can hover over a word and it'll show you where the word teacher was used in the conversation. It's one way you can dive in and say, okay, I want to see what they were talking about, immigration. And then you can look at highlights that people have made of the conversation. So volunteers are also going in and picking out things and writing little notes saying, hey, people should hear this because this is a really important point of view on such and such, for example. You can click on any part of the conversation at any time and hear the person talking. If we were actually diving in here, you'd be able to hear. Or you can click on and see the whole transcript. So here's the whole transcript of that conversation. If you go back to the home page, you can see the other chapters listed here. So there's Appleton and Wapaka counties on the bottom there. Also on this page is what we call a topic index, which is you can click on a given topic, and then conversations in which that topic came up a lot will pop up. Also, we are having teaching machines to point out to us portions of conversations that are about a given topic. That's the result of basically me going in and saying, okay, here's conversations about poverty, and then the engineers basically teaching the machines, this is stuff about poverty, go on and find some more for us. So the tool is really awesome, I have to say. Compared to the way I used to go through and analyze my transcripts, honestly, there's lots of great qualitative data software out there, but I was still using Post-it notes and highlighters until I met these folks. So yeah, it's pretty great. I've mentioned a few times now we're working with local media partners here in Madison. Our first partner was the Cap Times. They've used these voices in some coverage over the summer. Now we're also working with the Isthmus, with Channel 3000, and here are some other media partners around the country that we've been working with so far. So the hope is that through our media partners, we're amplifying what's going on in these conversations so it gets heard even beyond the participants in the network themselves. The dream is this. One day, there will be one of these things in every public library in the country. We're a long ways off. You can see we're at several dozen or so libraries so far, although there's quite a few in New York City. We don't have a Hearth in every library in New York City. I don't mean to imply that yet. But this is the dream. And for me, this is just one way in which I can take my role here as a faculty member at UW-Madison at a place where it's just commonly celebrated that we all are supposed to be using our talents for the broader public good. And I'm so grateful that I had this opportunity to work with these folks to put into action my desire after the 2016 election to not only yet again come before you and describe these things that I'm hearing, which are pretty depressing for all of us, but instead to try to create something that allows us all to listen in a productive way and better understand one another. So thank you all so much for listening to me, and now it's my turn to listen to you. So thank you so much.
All right, we'll just turn, as Professor Cramer has said, to questions, comments. Yes.
Okay.
So I know it's early in the process, but I wonder, you're looking for measurable outcomes. Have you been able to really see anything yet, other than the fact that you're getting all of this amazing data?
To be honest, we haven't started really measuring yet. I mean, we measure things like how many participants, hosts, how many people are logging into the website, but we have focused our attention on getting the infrastructure right of how to do this and what's working, what's not. But the measuring is coming soon. I can share with you briefly some of the things that we want to be able to measure. Just our people, I mean, one of the great things is because we're working with natural language processing, computational linguistics people, we can develop ways to search through the conversations and say, are people sharing personal experiences, and how often and under what conditions and what kind of prompts by the facilitators are bringing that about, right? So that's one of the things, and I'll just leave these up for a moment for you if you're interested. Other types of things we're interested in, but we do want it to matter, and so that's coming next. So maybe I'll be invited back in a couple of years, and hopefully I'll be able to show that it's making a difference. Thank you.
Hubert Humphrey applied your ideas 70 years ago, and that's why, although he never lived on a farm, he always got the farm vote, because he applied your ideas 70 years ago. He applied exactly what you're talking about in your book and made it realistic. And that's why he never lost a rural vote, although he never lived in a rural area and never lived on a farm. He used your ideas and he was incredibly successful.
Thank you.
It's very interesting. I'd like to know what you have learned so far from those who have been participants in these conversations regarding the extent to which the technology might affect the candidness of the conversations.
Oh. Well, I can tell you what people have said. And is it okay if I walk around or am I messing? Okay. I just wasn't sure if there was a camera. Okay, so sorry, I haven't been walking around more. I can't tell you what people have thought about, what people think, people who have thought about participating, but then in the end said, no way, I'm not coming near technology, right? So there's that whole group of people I don't know so much about, except just, several conversations I've had with folks. Usually what happens is people, they hear about it, they're skeptical, and then I bring this thing out and they go, oh, and there's a kind of curiosity about it and warming up to the idea. And then when people are able to go into the tool and not only hear and read their own conversation, but then listen into others, generally the feedback we've received is pretty positive. There's a little bit of discomfort with just using the tools and for the facilitators to use the Hearth, because they're not perfect. And honestly, the first batch, like my daughter and I helped solder together, so there's they're falling apart a little bit, But I guess I can speak best from my own experience, which is I am not a tech-savvy person, and I'm pretty averse to social media in general. And I now have not a different attitude about social media, but I have a very different attitude about the ability for technology to bring us together. Just one case in point is that this piece of technology, is a piece of technology that forces people to come together, right? As opposed to driving us apart. And so I suppose there's much more criticism than I've actually encountered and wariness of it, but for the most part, I think it's been a positive thing.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and the amazing work that you've been doing. I was wondering, can you tell me, what is the distribution of the libraries that you've targeted across urban and rural areas, and how do you target a place? What are the things that you keep in mind?
Yeah.
And are you thinking about other lines along which our society is divided, instead of just rural and urban, or just gender, or maybe gender and ethnic minorities as well? Yes,
thank you. So the presence in rural areas currently is very small. So it's just Wapaka and Appleton. I would not call rural. You used to call Appleton rural to people living in Appleton, and they know you're clearly from another planet, right? So there isn't a very big presence in rural areas currently. And so far, the way we have stretched to a new chapter has been by personal relationships. And so Madison was, let's try this thing out. Where should we go? Me saying, please, let's do it in Madison. And then Boston, because it's backyard of MIT and folks living there. And then New York City, because they're one of our key team members, actually two, I would say, at the time when we started in the Bronx, were journalists who had a lot of personal relationships in New York City. And so that's sort of how we've expanded so far. But in Birmingham, there's kind of a story along those lines for all of them. So now we're at a moment where we say, okay, we're in a range of places, especially when we figure out how to do things well in Wapaka and Appleton, which is Appleton's our smallest city, then we're going to figure out like what the criteria are for a new community to come online and the types of communities we have to bring online. So we're at a point where I can't tell you what the answer is yet, but we're at that point where we're trying to figure out what are the criteria. And definitely with respect to which divisions, yes, really what we want is for community members to that's wrong, because we're not asking community members to tell us what the divides are, but we're asking community members to tell us what their concerns are, and the divides that are relevant in a given community are kind of naturally arising. So for me, I've always had, since working on that book project, had a concern with the rural versus urban divide here in Wisconsin, around the country. So that's one thing I'm really keen on this addressing, but it's not the only one, right? Like partisan divides have been big, but class, racial, ethnic, gender is, it hasn't, it has come up. I don't, like my answer to that, the reason I'm stumbling is that there have been very few groups that have brought it up directly. And so that's another conversation to have when I hopefully come back in a few years. But yes, there are many that we need to pay attention to, right, and heal from. So absolutely, thank you.
You cited a handful of values that you use to govern the conversations around the Hearth. What kind of potential is there for social media platforms to incorporate those values in how they guide political discussions?
I'm the wrong person to ask. I'd say existing social media, there is some potential. Twitter, for example, has been working with Cortico. So Deb Roy was at Twitter for some time. He was their chief media scientist, research scientist. So they've been in conversation with Cortico about how to identify a healthy public sphere, how to identify healthy conversations. So I do see intent there. I think I'm more hopeful for new forms of social media that arise, and for people to be designing those with an eye toward, is there a way for us to use social media to bring us together in a way that's helpful for democracy as opposed to harmful? It's a great question. I hope you keep asking it.
Just a response to the previous exchange, it made me think about back in the days of blogs, which is ancient history for social media, but it was very clear that you needed a moderator who would kill the trolls. And unmoderated discussions just started going into the trash really quickly, but a moderator who would block and delete destructive people, you could actually get quite a conversation going that could stay constructive.
I don't know where it's going. I'm just going to grab water.
You see, there's no shortage of fascinating kinds of questions that can emerge from a group like this. I know they've got many others, because your last set of many of the questions just now were turning to this specific project, the Local Voices Network. But there are principles coming out of the discussion that go beyond just this particular format. They go back to some of the things that have in fact been highlighted throughout the semester. Issues of polarization. This isn't the first time we've heard about and expressed concerns about polarization. And I know there have been people in this particular course who've asked, as students, especially many of the students, what can we do?
Yeah.
What can we what can we undertake in our own kinds of settings? And you might recall that Dean Hess had suggestions about how one takes responsibility for matters. That across the kinds of discussions that have come up, this idea of listening, you heard about that too, in the discussion that had to do with food and agriculture. Remember Professor White, who talked about how her own research had been around listening, trying to figure out what were the kinds of concerns and how would one probe and pursue those kinds of concerns. So I would assume then that while a number of you haven't asked them tonight, you're really reflecting on what does it mean to have sets of ideas and strategies all associated with addressing concerns, public kinds of concerns. That's what we said the whole Wisconsin idea has revolved around. And perhaps there's nothing more encouraging. You've heard this time and again too, and it was certainly articulated tonight, a sense of pride of being affiliated with an institution that is committed to the notion of understanding, of responding to, and improving the kind of democratic society that we all seek. I say that having seen again some of the posts from last week where people said, you know, I felt kind of down when I heard about how bad Wisconsin is doing with reference to educational performance, the gap, the black-white gap there. And I said, yeah, I've always thought about Wisconsin. I was proud. And I was really upset when I heard Madison is worse than Milwaukee. But the kind of, the fact that there are issues, a part of what the whole discussion is about is unveiling, revealing the kinds of things, and then asking how collectively might we seek to address these. And so to return to the point that I was trying to make at the outset, this isn't about just what the problems might be of the rural population. I thought that was a powerful kind of statement, that it's so easy to find fault with others and see the others as being the problems without beginning with the stories that are there and looking for the common ground that certainly is to be important. And so I think that there are profound lessons from all of this for individual action, for collective action, but for especially understanding what the Wisconsin idea is supposed to be about. That doesn't mean that it's always been enacted in ways that would be visionary, but that leaves these possibilities for engagement, for the activity that all of us should be involved with. So again, please join me, and I think that Professor Cramer might be able to stay around for a little bit longer for individual questions if you want to raise them with her. But join me in thanking her.